Las Vegas, 1973. Just minutes before stepping on stage, Elvis Presley found a small frayed teddy bear sitting on his makeup table, a gift from his little girl, Lisa Marie. Most fathers would smile and move on. But what Elvis did next, before a crowd of 20,000, left even his band speechless. The desert air outside the Las Vegas Hilton shimmered under neon. It was February 14th, 1973, Valentine's night. Inside, a packed house of nearly 20,000 waited for the king. Cameras flashed like lightning over sequins and white satin. Every ticket was sold, every seat trembling with the hum of anticipation. Backstage, the hallway smelled faintly of hairspray and tobacco. Assistants rushed past with guitars and rhinestone jackets. Joe Esposito, Elvis's longtime road manager, checked his watch for the third time. The show was minutes away, and Elvis still hadn't appeared. The tension in the air was almost visible, that quiet, heavy stillness before an explosion. Then, from down the corridor, came a small sound no one expected. The soft, quick footsteps of a child. 5-year-old Lisa Marie Presley appeared in the doorway wearing a tiny pink coat. Her hair curled slightly at the ends, just like her father's. In her hands, she held a small stuffed bear, tan, one eye missing, its fur worn smooth from years of love. Joe smiled, stepping aside as she peeked into the dressing room. "Hey, Peanut," he said quietly. "He's getting ready." But she shook her head. "I want to give Daddy something first." Inside, Elvis sat before the mirror, white jumpsuit gleaming under the bulbs. He looked up and saw her reflection. Small, determined, clutching that bear-like treasure. For a moment, the noise outside, the tuning guitars, the stage crew calling cues, all faded away. There was only this tiny figure in the doorway, and a father's heart that suddenly softened. She walked up, holding the bear out with both hands. "This'll help you be brave, Daddy." Elvis chuckled, but his smile wavered. He turned in his chair, gently taking the toy from her. "Mr. Buttons, huh?" he said softly. "I remember him," Lisa nodded solemnly. "He's my favorite." He studied it for a moment, the worn stitching, the faded ribbon, then looked back at her. "And you sure you want to give him to me tonight?" She nodded again. "He'll keep you safe." Joe watched silently from the corner. There was something about that moment that felt sacred, as if the king of rock and roll had been reduced to just Daddy again, vulnerable, human, humbled. Elvis leaned forward, kissing her forehead. "All right, sweetheart," he whispered. "Mr. Buttons is coming with me." Then he stood, slipping on his cape with a flourish of white fabric and gold trim. The crowd's roar echoed through the walls, muffled but immense, like the ocean behind a door. He turned back once more to Lisa, kneeling so his eyes met hers. "You watch me from backstage, okay?" She smiled, eyes shining. "Okay." As Joe led her out, Elvis glanced at the bear resting on his makeup table. He could have left it there, but he didn't. He reached out, picked it up, and tucked it under his arm like a quiet promise. Outside, the announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, the one and only Elvis Presley." The band struck the opening note of CC Rider. The floor shook. And in that instant, Elvis Presley, father, legend, man, walked toward the blinding lights, holding a tiny bear that would soon make history. How often do our biggest moments begin with something small? Backstage, the muffled roar of the crowd seeped through the concrete walls. The air vibrated with the low hum of amplifiers, the scent of leather, and the faint sweetness of stage powder. Elvis adjusted his collar, but his eyes kept drifting toward the small bear now resting on his amp case, its stitched smile reflecting under the dressing lights. Joe Esposito leaned against the doorframe. "You really taking that thing out there?" Elvis half smiled. "Why not? My girl says he brings courage." Joe laughed, but Elvis's tone stayed gentle, almost protective. "She gave me her favorite toy, Joe. That's no small thing." He reached out, brushing his fingers across the bear's worn fur. In that instant, the man who had conquered charts, movies, and headlines looked quietly unsure. A father holding the weight of innocence. The stage manager's voice broke in through the intercom. 1 minute, Elvis. He didn't move, just stared at the mirror, at his reflection split between glitter and fatigue. 1 minute, he repeated softly, as though grounding himself in the promise he'd just made to a child. He whispered, "For her," under his breath, almost inaudible. The bear, perched beside his rings and sunglasses, caught a glint from the bulbs, like a tiny spotlight. He didn't need luck tonight. He needed love. Joe gave a small nod. "They're waiting, E." Elvis took a breath, scooped up the toy, and tucked it near his chest. The cape draped around him like armor, but the bear, that was the heart under the armor. As they moved down the corridor, the floor trembled with stomping feet. Crew members cleared the way, shouting cues over the echo of the band's opening chords. The moment felt larger than life, but Elvis's mind was still on a 5-year-old who believed he could do anything. He smiled at the thought. "That kid," he murmured. "She's got more faith in me than the whole world." Just before stepping through the curtain, he turned to Joe. "You know, when she was born, I promised I'd show her what love looks like. Maybe tonight's my shot." Joe's expression softened. "Then give him your heart, E." Elvis nodded, then paused. For a second, he looked back toward the dressing room hallway, where Lisa's tiny footprints still marked the carpet. It was as if he could feel her energy in that quiet space, the innocence, the purity of belief. And with that, he did something no one expected. He placed the bear on the edge of the curtain, where it could watch. It was a small, almost childlike gesture. But when he turned to face the lights, his shoulders seemed lighter. As the curtain began to rise, Elvis whispered one last thing only the stage mic caught. "Let's make her proud." The first note of CC Rider thundered through the speakers. The crowd erupted, but backstage that tiny bear remained, glowing faintly under the spotlight spill. A silent guardian of a promise between a father and his child. Have you ever carried someone's faith with you into the noise? Because in the next few minutes, that little bear would turn a routine concert into something history would never forget. Las Vegas, February 14th, 1973. Valentine's night. Outside the Hilton International, a sea of fans pressed against the marble walls, their breath misting in the desert chill. Inside, 20,000 seats shimmered under golden lights. Photographers loaded film, ushers whispered into headsets. The crowd wasn't just waiting for a show, they were waiting for a legend. Backstage, the corridors buzzed with static and motion. Trumpets blared through half-closed doors. Amplifiers hummed like restless animals. A faint smell of cigarette smoke and hairspray hung thick in the air. Joe Esposito, Elvis's right hand and closest friend, checked his watch for the 5th time. 3 minutes, he muttered to Charlie Hodge, who was adjusting a guitar strap. But the king hadn't emerged from his dressing room. The noise outside rose to a thunder, yet behind one quiet door, there was only stillness. Inside, Elvis Presley sat in front of a wide mirror, his white jumpsuit catching every bulb's glare. Rhinestones twinkled like constellations. But in the glass, he didn't see stardom. He saw a man fighting exhaustion, a father thinking of home. Then came a sound no one expected, a gentle knock, too soft to be a crew member. Joe frowned. "You hear that?" Elvis turned his head, curious. The door creaked open, and there stood 5-year-old Lisa Marie, her pink coat zipped to the neck, her small hands wrapped around something she hid behind her back. For a heartbeat, the hallway froze. This wasn't part of the schedule. She stepped inside, her shoes barely tapping the tile. "Daddy," she whispered, "I brought you something." Elvis smiled, that slow, gentle smile that no spotlight could fake. "Darling, what are you doing up so late?" She came closer and revealed it. A tiny stuffed bear, its fur worn thin, one button eye missing. "This'll keep you brave," she said, holding it out like an offering. The room softened. Even Joe, hardened by years of touring chaos, felt a lump in his throat. Elvis took the bear carefully, turning it over in his massive hands. "Mr. Buttons," he murmured. "You still got him, huh?" Lisa nodded. "He's my favorite, but you can have him tonight." He studied her face. So sure, so innocent. A man who had been called a king now sat humbled before the truest kind of royalty. A child's love. "You know," he said, his voice dropping low, "he's a lucky little fella." Lisa grinned. "He's going to help you sing better." The two laughed, and for that brief moment the noise of Vegas disappeared. Elvis set Mr. Buttons on the table beside his rings, scarves, and a pair of gold aviators. Then he leaned down, kissed Lisa's forehead and whispered, "You're my good luck charm, baby." Joe cleared his throat softly. It's time." Elvis nodded, but he didn't move right away. He stared at the teddy bear again. The stitching frayed. The ribbon faded. Something in him stirred. Fame, money, applause. None of it compared to the weight of that small gift. He stood, towering in white and gold, and scooped up the toy. "Guess you're coming with me tonight," he said quietly. As he walked toward the door, Joe caught his eye. "You serious, E?" Elvis grinned. "I ain't ever been more." The band began the intro, CC Rider rumbling through the speakers. The announcer's voice boomed, "Ladies and gentlemen, Elvis Presley." The roar from the crowd hit like a wave. Elvis took one last glance over his shoulder. Lisa waving shyly from the hallway, her tiny hand barely visible past the doorframe. He smiled, clutching the bear. "This one's for you, Peanut," he whispered, and with that, he stepped into the blinding lights, a father carrying his daughter's courage into history. How often do our greatest moments begin with something this small? The crowd's roar thundered above, shaking the rafters of the Hilton showroom. But backstage, everything felt suspended, a strange, charged quiet before impact. Elvis stood by the curtain, the spotlights flickering like distant lightning on his rhinestone suit. In his hand, he still held the tiny bear, its button eye catching a glint of the stage lights. Joe Esposito leaned closer, voice half a whisper. "You really taking that out there?" Elvis's reply came soft but steady. "It's her courage, Joe. She gave it to me. Wouldn't be right to leave it behind." The band launched into the warm-up riff of CC Rider. The vibration ran up the floorboards, through his boots, into his chest. Every show for years had begun this way. But tonight felt different. Tonight, something small had shifted. He wasn't stepping into the spotlight to prove anything. He was stepping into it carrying someone's trust. For once, the king didn't feel untouchable. He felt human. As he waited for the stage cue, he ran his thumb over the bear's frayed ear. It felt like an anchor, a reminder that beneath all the sequins, he was still just a dad trying to be brave in front of his little girl. Joe gave the signal. 30 seconds! Elvis took a breath, his reflection glinting in the chrome of a nearby amp. His lips barely moved. "For her," he whispered. Then came the call from the stage manager. "Go!" The curtain split. The lights exploded white. The crowd erupted. 1,000 flashes firing at once. He stepped forward, the bear still in his left hand, half hidden behind the microphone. Nobody noticed it, not yet. But to him it was louder than the band, louder than the cheers. Every lyric he sang carried something warmer, gentler. Even his usual stage swagger seemed softened, almost protective. Up front, women screamed and reached toward the stage. Elvis smiled, but his gaze often drifted past the lights, toward the wings, where Lisa watched from a stool beside Joe. She was clapping her small hands, eyes glowing with pride. Have you ever felt someone watching you? Not to judge, but to believe. Every time his voice cracked with emotion, Lisa smiled wider. She thought Daddy was just singing, but something inside him was changing. Between songs, Elvis leaned down to adjust his mic. The bear tumbled slightly, catching the glow of a blue spotlight. He steadied it carefully, then brushed the fur with his finger as though to thank it. No one in the audience could see it clearly, but Joe noticed. He saw Elvis's expression. soft, focused, and strangely peaceful. When the intermission bell rang, Elvis didn't head straight for the dressing room. He walked instead to the edge of the curtain, looked back at Lisa, and gave a little wink, the kind only a father and daughter would understand. Joe followed him off stage. "You all right, E?" Elvis smiled faintly. "Better than all right. She reminded me who I'm singing for." The sound of the crowd chanting his name grew louder. He turned toward the stage again, gripping the bear tighter. "Let's give 'em something real," he said, and stepped back under the lights. Can love, pure and simple, turn even a stage into a sanctuary? Because in the next few minutes, before a roaring crowd, Elvis would do something no one in his band or audience could have predicted. The lights dimmed to amber, and a hush rippled through 20,000 people. Elvis stood center stage, guitar strap across his shoulder, a single spotlight cutting through the smoke. In his left hand, barely visible to the audience, was the small, worn teddy bear. Its fur caught the edge of the beam, one faded patch glowing gold. The first note of C.C. Rider crashed through the hall. Brass flared, drums rolled. The crowd rose as one, shouting his name. But behind the practiced grin, Elvis felt something different pulsing beneath his ribs. Tonight, every lyric was personal. Every breath carried weight. He glanced towards stage left. In the shadows near the curtain, a tiny silhouette swung its legs on a stool. Lisa Marie, watching. Her eyes sparkled like two spotlights of their own. She was too young to understand pressure, but she understood love. And that was enough. He wasn't just performing tonight, he was proving that fame hadn't stolen his heart. Elvis's voice soared, rich and raw. Sweat glistened on his temple. Rhinestones flashed each time he turned. Fans screamed every lyric back at him. Yet somehow, he felt utterly alone with that bear. Each time he looked at it, the noise around him blurred, replaced by the sound of a 5-year-old saying, "This'll keep you brave." Between songs, he reached for a silk scarf and handed it to a fan in the front row. "That's for you, honey," he said with a grin, then turned back to the mic. But when he set the scarf down, he tucked Mr. Buttons gently beside the microphone stand, where the whole arena could finally see it. A collective murmur spread through the audience. Cameras zoomed. No one understood yet, but everyone felt the intimacy of it. For a man who'd built a career on spectacle, this was suddenly quiet. When the noise of the world fades, what remains worth holding on to? He moved into Can't Help Falling in Love. The orchestra softened. The crowd swayed. His voice dropped lower, almost tender. In that hush, he reached down and brushed the bear's ear again. For a split second, the king of rock and roll looked like every father at bedtime. Gentle, weary, and completely human. Some in the audience thought it was a stage prop. But Joe Esposito knew it was Lisa's bear, and the reason Elvis's voice cracked on the bridge was that he was holding back tears. Charlie Hodge strummed quietly beside him, whispering between verses, "You all right, E?" Elvis nodded without looking up. "Never better, Charlie." His eyes stayed locked on the toy. "That little thing's got power, man." The crowd began clapping in rhythm, thousands of hands, a living heartbeat, the kind of unity that only happens when vulnerability meets fame. It was no longer a concert, it was communion. As the song ended, the arena went dead silent, a silence so heavy it pressed against the walls. Elvis didn't move for a few seconds. Then he spoke, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. "I got a little friend with me tonight," he said. "My daughter gave him to me before the show." He lifted the bear slightly. Spotlights converged on it. The crowd erupted, not in screams but applause that sounded almost protective. In that instant, 20,000 strangers saw the man behind the myth. Joe backstage wiped his eyes. Even the cameramen hesitated, not wanting to break the spell. Elvis smiled faintly and set the bear atop his amp, facing the audience. "He's watching out for me," he added softly. Then, with a grin that was half shy, half proud, he turned to the band. "All right, fellas, let's give 'em something from the heart." The first chords of You Gave Me a Mountain began to rise, a song about struggle, love, and redemption. It was the perfect storm. His voice, the bear, The crowd leaning in, the story unfolding in real time. Can one small gesture change how the world remembers a legend? Because by the time the last note rang out, that teddy bear wouldn't just be a child's toy anymore. It would become a symbol that would follow Elvis for the rest of his life. The lights dimmed again. Only the glow from the footlamps remained. Elvis stood at center stage, the crowd waiting for his next move. For a long moment he said nothing. The silence stretched so long that even the brass section lowered their instruments. The king had gone still. Then he spoke, his voice steady but low. "This next one," he said, "is for someone who gave me something special tonight." He reached to his side, lifted the tiny bear from the amplifier, and held it up for everyone to see. The spotlights followed his hand. Gasps rolled through the crowd like wind through leaves. Some laughed softly, unsure of what they were witnessing. Others pressed closer, drawn to the vulnerability in his face. Elvis smiled faintly. "My little girl gave me this before I walked out here," he said. "Said it'd keep me brave." A single shout came from the balcony. "Sing it for her, E!" And the whole arena erupted in applause. Elvis's eyes glistened. He blinked hard, then turned back toward the band. "Let's do You Gave Me a Mountain." Real slow, the drummer gave a quiet count-in. The first chords floated out, solemn and wide. As the melody built, Elvis placed the bear carefully on top of his amp, facing the audience, like a silent witness. He leaned into the mic, closed his eyes and sang the opening line, "Born in the heat of the desert." The room shifted. Thousands of people who moments ago were shouting fell completely silent. The song's story of struggle and forgiveness hit deeper than usual. Every note felt like confession. Every pause trembled with truth. It wasn't performance anymore. It was prayer. Joe Esposito watched from the wings. "He's somewhere else tonight," he whispered to Charlie Hodge. Charlie nodded, tears in his eyes. "He's singing to her." At the bridge, Elvis's voice cracked. It wasn't the mic, it was emotion. He steadied himself, hand trembling on the stand. The crowd could feel it. They weren't watching a superstar now. They were watching a father bearing his soul in front of 20,000 witnesses. When was the last time you saw love break through fear in real time? The final verse rose like a wave. Elvis lifted his hand toward the lights, palm open, as if releasing something he'd been carrying for years. The orchestra swelled. The drums fell away. He held the last note far longer than anyone expected, his voice echoing through the rafters until it became pure vibration. When the sound faded, nobody clapped. For nearly 5 full seconds there was only silence, thick, reverent, almost holy. Then a single cheer broke the stillness. Another followed. Then the entire arena erupted, not in frenzy but gratitude. It wasn't the loudest applause of his career, but it was the most human. Elvis turned, picked up the bear again, and bowed slightly toward the wings where Lisa watched. She giggled, clapping with both hands, her little face lit by the reflection of 1,000 flashbulbs. He mouthed the words, "That one was for you." Backstage crew members exchanged glances, some smiling, some wiping their eyes. Even the camera operators, hardened by years of covering spectacle, were quiet. When the applause finally subsided, Elvis stepped to the mic one last time. "Sometimes," he said, "a man just needs a little reminder of what matters." He held up the bear again, smiled, and handed it gently to Joe. "Keep him safe till I'm done." The crowd cheered once more, louder this time, and the energy in the room shifted from awe to joy. The band kicked into Burning Love, but everyone knew the concert had already peaked, not musically, but emotionally. Isn't it strange how one act of tenderness can outshine a lifetime of spotlight? As Elvis turned away, Joe tucked the toy under his arm. The camera caught him doing it, and for a brief instant, the whole story, father, daughter, courage, was preserved on film. Because what happened when the lights went down would reveal just how deeply that tiny bear had changed him. The last chord still vibrated through the Hilton showroom when the curtain dropped. The sound of 20,000 voices chanting his name bled through the velvet, then slowly faded. Backstage, the air changed. Thicker, quieter, almost fragile after so much noise. Elvis stepped into the shadows first, shoulders heaving. The rhinestones on his jumpsuit caught the low light like bits of broken glass. He handed his mic to Charlie Hodge, then pressed both palms to his face. For a long moment he didn't speak. The band's laughter, the clatter of cases, none of it reached him. Joe Esposito came forward, holding the small teddy bear. "You left this on the amp?" Elvis looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed. He took the bear carefully, thumb tracing the missing button eye. "Yeah," he whispered. "Couldn't have done it without him." He sank onto the couch in his dressing room, the adrenaline slowly draining away. Sweat darkened the collar of his suit. His cape lay crumpled beside him like shed armor. Across the room, under a thin blanket, Lisa Marie had fallen asleep on a love seat. One arm dangling, hair tousled, her face soft and peaceful. For the first time that night, the king didn't look victorious. He looked home. Elvis stood and walked over, every step quiet on the carpet. He knelt beside her, still holding the toy. The sound of the crowd outside had become a dull ocean, distant but constant. He placed Mr. Buttons beside her pillow, arranging its little arms so it faced her. Joe watched from the doorway. "You want me to tell the crew to clear out?" Elvis shook his head. "Nah, let 'em pack up, just keep it quiet a minute." He brushed a strand of hair from Lisa's forehead. Under the harsh bulbs, his hands trembled slightly. "You're the brave one, baby," he whispered. "You gave me more strength than the crowd ever could. When everything you've built depends on applause, how do you measure love that asks for nothing in return?" A knock came from the corridor. Someone from Colonel Parker's staff asking about the encore schedule. Joe stepped out, closing the door behind him. For once, nobody pushed Elvis to hurry. Time slowed. He looked down again at his sleeping daughter. A tiny smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. "That song was for you, Peanut," he murmured. Then almost to himself, "You gave me my mountain and helped me climb it." He slipped off one of his silk scarves and laid it gently over her shoulders like a blanket. The white fabric glowed against the dim couch light. The bear rested beside her, half hidden in the folds. The noise of packing crates echoed faintly outside. The concert was ending, but something in him was still opening. He exhaled, long and slow, then whispered, "She's the reason I can walk out there." The world thought Elvis's power came from the stage. He knew better. It came from a 5-year-old asleep in the corner. Who steadies you when the spotlight fades? Because before the night ended, that small bear would take on a life of its own, becoming more than a keepsake. It would become a legacy. Morning light seeped through the thin hotel curtains. The noise of the strip had already started. Horns, slot machines, delivery trucks. But inside Elvis's suite, everything was quiet. On the table near the window sat a single object. A tiny worn teddy bear, fur still flecked with stage glitter from the night before. Joe Esposito came in carrying coffee. "You didn't sleep, huh?" Elvis smiled faintly, eyes still on the bear. "Didn't want to. Felt like if I closed my eyes I'd wake up and think it never happened." He picked up Mr. Buttons, brushing off a few rhinestones. "She doesn't even know what she did, Joe. Whole crowd changed last night. It wasn't about fame for a few minutes. It was about feeling alive." He'd sung to millions before, but for the first time, he'd been heard. Joe nodded. "You planning to keep it with the gear?" Elvis shook his head slowly. "No, this one goes home." Hours later, when they flew back to Memphis, the bear rode in the seat beside him, buckled in with its own strap. The flight attendant smiled, assuming it was a joke. Elvis didn't explain. He just looked out the window, the Nevada desert shrinking below, and thought about Lisa's quiet smile when he tucked her into bed. When does a moment stop being a performance and become a memory? At Graceland, the house was still, the air thick with southern summer. Elvis walked upstairs to Lisa's room, the walls lined with crayons drawings and toy horses. He placed Mr. Buttons carefully on her dresser, right beside a small music box that played Love Me Tender. Then he added a note in his looping handwriting. For Daddy's lucky night. Years passed. The Vegas shows came and went, but that bear never left the room. Visitors who caught a glimpse of it sometimes asked about its story, and Priscilla would smile softly, saying, "It's from the night he sang like it was his last." When Elvis was gone, the toy remained, small enough to fit in a child's hand, powerful enough to hold a legend's heart. In the decades that followed, when Graceland opened its doors to the public, that same bear appeared behind glass in a corner display. Faded fur, missing eye, tiny handwritten tag. Mr. Buttons, Lisa Marie's favorite, gifted to Elvis before his 1973 Las Vegas show. Fans stopped longer there than at the gold records. Some cried quietly. They didn't see fabric and thread. They saw the proof that greatness and gentleness could share the same stage. What if the things we leave behind aren't trophies, but reminders of who we loved most? Late one afternoon, a tour guide dusted the display and noticed how the sunlight hit the glass, scattering little sparks across the wall, tiny, glittering lights that looked almost like rhinestones. The story of a father, a daughter, and a simple toy had outlived every headline. And in those quiet rooms of Graceland, when the crowds were gone, the legend still whispered through the stillness. He sang for her. Because one final reflection would reveal what that moment truly meant, not just for Elvis, but for anyone who's ever needed love to steady their voice. Years later, visitors still filed through the gates of Graceland. The rooms gleamed with trophies, platinum discs, and jumpsuits under glass. But in one quiet corner, away from the flashbulbs, something humbler drew the longest stares. A tiny stuffed bear sitting behind a velvet rope. Its fur had faded to grey, its ribbon was frayed, yet somehow it radiated more warmth than all the gold in the room. The plaque beneath it read, Mr. Buttons, given by Lisa Marie Presley to her father, February 14, 1973, no other explanation. None needed. Tourists leaned closer, some whispering, some silent. They didn't come to see perfection. They came to feel the man who once carried courage in the form of a child's toy. Because in the end, the crown never defined him. Love did. Elvis had always said that fame was the world's loudest echo. But echoes fade. What stays are the quiet gestures no one expects. The ones that cost nothing, yet change everything. When the spotlight burns out, what's left shining in us? That night in Las Vegas wasn't about a concert. It was about connection. About a father remembering who he was beneath the rhinestones. In those minutes, he wasn't the king. He was just Daddy, singing for the only audience that ever truly mattered. The story of Mr. Buttons became part of Presley legend, told in interviews, remembered by crew, repeated by fans who were never there but swore they could feel it. Each retelling carried the same truth. Greatness isn't measured by how loud the crowd roars, but by how softly the heart can speak. Joe Esposito once said in an interview years later, he could fill an arena, but he lived for that little girl's smile. That was his real stage. For all the gold records, that tiny bear became his most honest trophy, and maybe that's what the world keeps chasing. Not fame, not applause, but proof that even legends need something small to remind them who they are. What would your Mr. Buttons be? The one thing that keeps you human when the noise gets too loud. When visitors leave the museum today, the guide dims the lights, and the bear catches a single beam from the window. A shimmer like the glow of a spotlight. It's quiet, still, eternal, and somewhere in that stillness, you can almost hear a soft southern voice whispering, "This one's for you, Peanut." If this story moved you, share it with someone who reminds you what truly matters. Sometimes the greatest legends aren't born on stage. They're born in small acts of love that never fade. Let that thought stay with you tonight.